Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you for joining this session today. So I'm Mohammad Ismail. I'm a senior Java developer in Amadeus. I've been working here for 3 years almost, and mainly I work in the platform development side, so developing libraries for Amadeus loyalty department especially. So today for the presentation we would talk about a quick overview for Amadeus in case you don't know Amadeus, and we will then dig deep in the technical side, so what I've been working on for the past few months in Amadeus about Quartz and Spring Batch integration, and then we will look at some code for how Spring Batch would work in a multi-tenancy, and finally we will see some ideas that we can do for the future for cloud native batch processing. Okay, so to quickly highlight who's Amadeus. Amadeus is the leading IT company in travel industry. We affect people's lives daily in different sectors in traveling, so airlines, airports, hotels. You will find Amadeus all over the place in these sectors. And I want to bring your attention to some of the technological evolution that Amadeus went through. So the most important part, I don't want this to be a history lesson for you, but the important part in here is the decommissioning fully of mainframe, which is not easy to do in a company in the size of Amadeus. They have very big products and it's not easy to do. And then the award that Amadeus won with Couchbase in loyalty. And finally the partnership now we're having with Microsoft for moving to Microsoft Azure, so our migration to the cloud. So now let's get into the technical topics, so batch processing. So what you will see here is what I've been working on for many months so far. So first let's check in here how important is batch processing. So batch processing is not dead, obviously. It's still important, very important in airlines industry, and as you see in here, we have to deal with millions and millions and millions of records daily for all of the airlines that we're dealing with. So the best way to start is to see what did we have. So obviously we had this situation. We're not new to batch processing, so we had something in place. So the first thing is it was an in-house Quartz-based solution, and it is only single-threaded, so no multi-threading at all. And we were missing different utilities that can help developers developing their batch jobs. And finally, no utilities for fault tolerance. So the handling of fault tolerance was not good enough, so this can be risky and at the same time annoying for your daily life. So how did we change this? So there was no project about this actually to improve this, but it started as some few developers through what we call tech labs in our company. We were discussing, okay, how we can make this better, how we can make our lives better, because in the next slides you will see how annoying is it to deal with the previous solution that we had. So we did some studies after we aligned on the points that we need to enhance, and different frameworks looking for different solutions. And finally, the management saw the benefit of this solution, and we got an approval to make this an official project, and we went through it. So what is this idea? It's basically Spring Batch and Quartz together as the new core of this framework that will power our batch processing in loyalty. So how many of you knows Spring Batch or worked with Spring Batch? Okay, 4. So how many in Quartz? Anyone worked with Quartz before? Okay. So batch processing in general, how many of you dealt with batch processing? Okay. Okay. So let's first go through one by one. So Spring Batch. Let's have a quick idea of what's Spring Batch. So this is the simplest design I can show you, so it doesn't get complex for you. So first you have your batch job, and in each job you can develop a step. And these steps can include readers, processors, writers, and the input can be whatever you need. So you're reading from database, or you're reading some files. And for writing, same way. You can write in database files, whatever, Kafka queues. So, and in here you see the job has, in this design, one step, but you can have as many steps as you want. And this is the simplest form that I can show you for Spring Batch. But the question now is, why Spring Batch? So let's start with reusability. So today, in the previous framework, it was very hard to develop stuff. So always you start from scratch. There is nothing that you can really reuse. The readers, writers, processors that comes with Spring Batch, easily reusable, but by anyone in whatever sector they are working in. And this is very beneficial in your daily life. You don't want to spend weeks trying to develop a reader that has been done years and years ago. And for maintainability, so as you saw in the previous slide, it's steps. So the steps are decoupled. You can test them, change them, without having effects on each other, which is very important, so you don't cause many regressions. For scaling, so we have in here many ways of doing parallel processing out of the box in Spring Batch. And as I showed you before, you're dealing with a huge amount of records every day. And whenever you get a new customer, this is increasing and increasing. So you need to be quick with your batch jobs, so you can have enough resources to schedule other jobs later on. And for fault tolerance, so this is a big issue of the previous solution. So there is no way to do recovery from where you failed. You don't want to always repeat from scratch. Also in Spring Batch you get skip and retrying capabilities. And why is this important? Because trust me, you don't want to come in Monday and try to recover some jobs manually by yourself. It's very annoying. And then we have multiple file formats. So we deal with many files in Airlines. It's many different formats. Almost every subformat you can imagine, depends on what sector you are dealing with. And this support that comes from Spring Batch out of the box is really important, so you can be very efficient and get away from dealing with the basic stuff and move on with your business. And finally, resource management. So as I mentioned to you, you're not restarting from scratch, so you have more resources to deal with. Plus, these readers that deal with files are using streaming, so it's efficient for your memory too. So now we move on to Quartz. So we talked about Spring Batch in a simple way and why we went with Spring Batch. But now why we mentioned let's do with Quartz. So for Quartz in here, let's add it to the picture. So Quartz is here to handle our scheduling and definitions of these jobs. So one Quartz job can use the Spring Batch job launcher to trigger any Spring Batch job that you have. So you can implement your batch jobs using Spring Batch, but you will need one Quartz job that will be able to trigger these jobs for you. So now we talk why Quartz in details. So first thing is dynamic scheduling. So in here, Quartz, when you schedule, it's stored in database. So you can change at runtime without redeploying your application or restarting. You can change the scheduler, and immediately the scheduling will change, and you can run the jobs in different times. This is important because at least in airlines industry, every airline wants to run different jobs at different times. Next, job details. So there is something in Quartz called job details. So basically, it's the definitions of your jobs. So you store when I will run this job, what job parameters the job needs. You can name your job differently. So it's the definition of your job stored again in a database. So multi-job definition. So this is an idea that we did. It's not something that comes from Quartz itself, but Quartz enable you to do this. So basically you can have one job class in your code, and you can define it multiple times with different names. So let's give an example of when would you need this feature. So let's say you have the same job doing the same thing for different partners of airlines, but each partner wants, let's say, a different scheduling time. So for that, this would help you in here. You can define the same job. You wouldn't rewrite the code or anything. Just define another definition for the same class you have, just with different times, different name. And finally, server recovery. So Quartz is aware of server recovery. If your application shut down and comes back up, Quartz has the feature to know, okay, I can recover this for you if you want. You can check, is this recovery or not, using Quartz. So now let's move on to the challenges with this solution. So first thing is the topic that we will go through today is the Spring Batch in multi-tenancy. So I will give you more details about this in this presentation. Then the thread management. So you have, as I showed you, Quartz running with Spring Batch, but each one of them got their own thread pool. So in here you need to be careful about how you manage your threads. And by the way, you can run Quartz and Spring Batch on the same thread pool, but we didn't want to do this because you can benefit from having different thread pools by, for example, running some multi-threads in a Spring Batch job, but you need one thread for Quartz to just start the execution of your Spring Batch. And backward compatibility. So you see, before I showed you that there was a previous solution, now there's a new solution, but we had so many jobs already implemented in the previous solution, so you don't change this in one day. Suddenly you have all of your jobs in Spring Batch and running in this new core. So whatever we implement in here, it needs to be backward compatible. So any old job needs to be still running, but of course they can, the different teams will do the migration in their own basis. And finally is the server recovery. So we mentioned before, Quartz is giving this feature. But why is it a challenge? So Quartz is giving you this feature in Quartz itself, but you're trying to use this to recover at the end of the day a Spring Batch job, not the Quartz job itself. So for the other three topics you see in here, I won't talk about them today. You can come to our booth or you can catch me anywhere. We can talk about these topics, but we will focus on the first one, Spring Batch in multi-tenant architecture. So just let me check the time. Fine. So let's start with what's multi-tenant architecture, just in case some of you might not be aware. So I will show you, it comes in different forms. What I will show you in here is the one we are using in loyalty, and what was the challenge for us. So in here you see that we have one database, but with many different schemas. Each You can imagine in here each airline, for example, running on their own schema, but under this one database. After that, you have your application level. So the application is one code base for all the airlines, but running in many instances and dealing with this database that we mentioned before. And then you have your load balancing, where your agents or customers or your admins would reach your application and their data through this load balancer. So this is the form we have in loyalty. As I said, it has other forms, but we won't focus on them. So now let's take a look at this. So Spring Batch and Single-Tenant. So I have my Spring Batch thread in here, one Spring Batch execution using a data source. So each Spring job needs a data source if you are storing the metadata in database. So with Spring Batch comes some metadata for their tables. So you can, for example, know how many records did you read, how many records did you write, the job parameters you used to execute this job, and so on. There's 6 tables for metadata. And when you deal with them, you need a data source. So Spring Batch needs a data source that will reach the database. So if we look here, what could be the challenge in here? So right now in this single tenant, my data source in here doesn't try to know, am I going for organization 1 or 2 or 3? I'm just targeting the same place always. So it's very easy to implement, no complexity. But now what I need for in multi-tenancy is to be able to route to the correct database. And because of this challenge, so in here I'm still showing you with only one thread, the Spring Batch thread. Now imagine we add Quartz to the picture. It's another thread that's not also aware of what's happening in the Spring Batch thread. So for this, let's look at the full picture now with Spring Batch, Quartz, all in multi-tenancy. So first you have in here your Quartz execution in a Quartz thread. So this is your Quartz job. Imagine it got triggered right now according to the schedule you set. And as we said before, Quartz will use the job launcher of Spring Batch. So now it triggered your Spring Batch execution. So now you have another thread. It's the Spring Batch thread. Spring Batch, as we said, will use the data source. And this data source will now route you to the correct database. So how we will do this? The way is we will use job parameters. So what you will see in here is simplifying what's really happening. So I cannot just say in job parameters organization 1 and now I'm allowed to reach there. Of course there is security in here, so you need to make sure you're using users that are authenticated. Whoever is triggering the job should be authenticated. It can be a robotic user if you're scheduling your jobs. It can be any person that's allowed to launch jobs, and their user should be also having the permissions to execute plus access the database. So finally, after this, the summary would be, you can imagine in your job parameters, you know what am I targeting, and you are allowed to target it. So now this job parameter will be first in my Quartz thread. So remember that Quartz started everything. You have the parameter. This thread is aware of this organization. And then we move on to Spring Batch. So once I trigger Spring Batch, in Java you can use thread local, so you can make sure this organization is known also in the next thread. And after that, since we are data sources just on the same thread as Spring Batch, because Spring Batch is actually what will use data source. So the data source will use what's in your thread, retrieve what's in thread local to know the schema, and then the data source itself will reroute you to the correct database. So from this, what we need to implement is a data source that can switch between the databases, relying on the thread local, relying on what was in Spring Batch thread to know the schema and do the job. So now I will show you some code of how you would implement a job and how we will do this multi-tenancy solution. We will not go through Quartz. It will be focused on Spring Batch and multi-tenancy. So this job, let's imagine I want to import reservation data for my passengers. So let's imagine the file comes as JSON filled with passenger data from a reservation system. What I need to do, if you remember, I mentioned to you in the Spring Batch design, you have a reader, processor, writer. So the reader in here is a JSON item reader, since I'm dealing with this JSON file. And then it will continue to the item processor, which you can imagine it a service that I am triggering just to credit my passenger for traveling. And finally, JSON item writer, I want to export the results after this service was triggered and see my data in a JSON file again. So this is what we look at in the code. So let me just switch. Okay, just having an issue to switch to. Okay. Okay, so let's first look at implementing a job in Spring Batch. So this is the job we talked about. So import reservation data job. So what you need to do here is to annotate it as configuration. So if you dealt before with Spring, you know at the beginning you were dealing with XML files, configuration files. So in here now you use the annotation instead in Java. And the first thing you will do is you create a job bean. So to create this job bean, you can use directly a job builder factory that comes directly from Spring Batch. So this is something you don't need to implement, you can use directly. And what you need to give is just a name for this job, and then finally, what are the steps? Again, you can do as many steps and flows as you want. This is just to simplify the example, it's just one step. So let's talk about the step. So the step is the reader-writer processor that we saw in the blueprint I showed you. So in here, again, you have a step builder factory. So it's just like you have one for job, you have one for step that helps you building your step. You need to give a name for the step. The one we are dealing with right now is a chunk step. There is two types. I don't want to go through them, but chunk is basically what allows you to do reader-writer processor. And there is something called tasklet, which is you can implement whatever you want. Just open the tasklet class and go ahead and do whatever you want. So in here we're using a chunk to see the reader processor writer. So if you look here, you need to pass beans for a reader and a processor and a writer. So let's now go through them. So I'm creating in here a bean for JSON item reader, because we were saying we will deal with a JSON file. And you can use the builder. Again, everything you see so far is out of the box from Spring Batch. Nothing done by me. No custom implementation so far. So using the builder, I need to give a name for the reader, and you need to pick what kind of JSON object reader you want to use. So in here, Spring Batch supports, for example, Jackson. Again, this Jackson reader you see coming again from Spring Batch itself. And finally, you need to give the resource. So where am I reading from? Where is the file that I will read from? So once I have this basic information, the reader accepts more properties, by the way, and they are different in different readers. But this is a simple JSON item reader. So now we check the processor adapter. So why we picked an item processor adapter? So what's this one? So in Spring Batch, they have this processor out of the box. Basically, you give it your service bean. Again, in here we said we want to use this credit service to credit some points for a passenger. So you can give your service bean to it, the service object, and in here you can specify whatever method in that object that you want to trigger, and Spring will handle the rest for you. So simply with this, when I give the reservation service, so this is the service that will credit, and the method name inside is called credit. When I give this, once the processor is triggered, it will trigger this method inside your service. So now I have a reader and a processor, so finally the writer. So for the writer, again a JSON file writer as we showed in the blueprint, and same, you see in here the same way as you done the reader. You give a name. In here now you're dealing with marshalling, so you need a marshaller. Again, Jackson is supported in Spring Batch, so you can give that one. And finally a resource, where am I gonna export this output for you. And with this way, you see, this is the whole job basically implemented and done. And just to show you an example of some data, this is a JSON array, and here is one passenger, and you always, with the item reader that comes from Spring Batch, it's expecting it to start with an array. If you have different cases, you can again implement your custom readers. So now we have our job. We need to move on to the data source. So in here I have a data source that extends abstract data source that comes from Spring. So what's important in data source is overriding a method called getConnection. So how I get your database connection. This is the most important method you need to deal with. So in here you see I'm just creating a data source. Just it's simple. You just take the properties of what's the user and password for your database, and simply have a data source ready to connect to your database. Then in here you see I got the connection. Now I have a connection. So far I did not switch to any schema. So I'm still a similar implementation to Single-Tenant. So now you see, let's forget about this if condition, we will come back to it. Now you see that I need to use connection.setSchema and give my schema. So where did the schema come from? Sorry. Okay, so the schema came from this line. So I have a context holder, and I said get schema. So okay, what's this context holder? So it's the thread local I was telling you about. So you just you're using a thread local that will be filled at one stage before all of this happening, and then through the get method that you have in here, I will know the schema. So let's go back now. So I used the get method, I got my schema, I can set it in here. So okay, where did this the set of schema happen in this solution? So for this we can go to the job launcher. In here, I implemented a custom job launcher for the sake of this demonstration. So in Spring Batch job launcher, it tries to create a thread so you can execute your job inside that thread using task executors. So once this thread is there, I can use the job parameters to get my schema, set it in this context holder. So my job, when it was launched, it knows the schema from job parameters. It told the thread, this is the schema. Now your data source can use it later on when it turns comes. So now I know where did I set the schema. I know where I got it, and once I'm trying to connect to database, I set the schema and return the connection so Spring Batch can use it. But why still we have this if condition? Why I'm saying if the database is not known, if the database is known, you set the schema. But if it's not known, you're not doing anything. So what's the case in here that the database will not be known? Because my Spring Batch, when it launches, it knows. So can any of you guess? Sorry? No, that's not the reason, because all the records will be in that thread. It will keep running, so still your thread will be aware. Okay, I can show you in here. So this job builder factory that built your job is using a job repository. So what's the job repository? It's just the repository that's doing the, let's say, CRUD operations on the metadata of Spring Batch. So this job repository is for Spring Batch, coming from Spring Batch. What happens in here, since you are dealing with this job repository, Spring Batch tries, when the bean is created, it tries to connect the database to know what type of database you are dealing with. Because it can, for example, benefit from this for automatically creating your metadata tables in whatever database you are using. So it can know I'm dealing with Oracle, I'm dealing with SQL, or whatever type. And since this will happen, for example, in this scenario, if I launch right now the application, it will try to connect the database. But I don't have a job running. I don't know what schema I'm targeting. But I just need to know what database you're dealing with. And this is why we have this check in here. It's so that if I am just launching the application, Spring Batch, trying to create some beans, trying to know what database type I'm dealing with. In here, I don't know the schema, and I don't want to know the schema. It's enough for me to connect to your database to know the type. So I wouldn't set a schema in this scenario. And this is where it will be a null schema in here. So now let me see if this would work. Okay. So back to the presentation. So we saw how you will implement a job and do your multi-tenancy in Spring Batch. So now let's take a look at the future vision that we have. These are just possibilities, so you can take them as speculations, or it might happen, or it might be a mix of what I'm telling you right now. So in here, it's we need to think about cloud-native batch processing. So as you saw before, I told you we have a partnership with Microsoft. We are trying to move on with our applications to the cloud. So we need to think about how our batch processing would work in the cloud. So the first idea in here could be Azure Batch with Spring Batch instead of Quartz. So in here, Azure Batch will act in a similar way to Quartz. It will be responsible for scheduling the jobs. Azure Batch can be aware of the pods going down and coming back up, so it can do some kind of recovery for you. And another thing could be standalone jobs. So you take your jobs and they are not in the same application. Each job can be in one VM. And I start the job once I need it, and I immediately kill it once it's done. With this way, you achieve a really good resource management, because the application is not running anymore. Nothing is consuming your resources. So this could be a benefit of this design. Another thing is, let's take the jobs in one application and deploy all of them in a single application. What's the benefit in here? So the benefit is simple. Your business application, your platform, is safe from whatever happens in batch. So if batch causes some big issues in the application, my business platform is totally safe from whatever happened here, because you in batch processing, you have big traffic. If you're not managing things nicely, you can consume many threads and cause your application big issues. And finally, if we try to see how we can do machine learning in here, maybe you can mine and learn from the data you're consuming, of course depending on this data, so it's not any data applicable for this one. So yeah, if you have any questions, you can ask. Yep. Okay, so if any questions comes to you, you can approach me at any time. We have our booth for Amadeus. You can come ask any question. And thank you a lot for joining this session, everyone.